If you can't carry your own tray, maybe stay home, Grandpa. The words cut through the late morning chatter inside Harper's diner like a shard of glass. A few people chuckled uncomfortably. One of the waiters froze mid-step. Others stared into their coffee cups or the speckled patterns on their plates, pretending not to have heard. But the man they were aimed at, an elderly veteran with slow, shaking hands, said nothing. He just kept walking, his legs trembling beneath the weight of his own body, each step as deliberate as it was fragile. At a table in the back, a man in uniform quietly stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't lecture. He didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. But what he did next turned the entire room silent. Walt Morgan, 79, had arrived at Harper's Diner at precisely 9:10 a.m., same as every Sunday for the last 14 years. The retired Army Staff Sergeant wore his usual olive jacket, faded from age, and carried a wooden cane with the initials WM burned into its side. Each step he took told the story of the spinal injury he sustained during a firefight in the Mekong Delta in 1969, when his squad's convoy had been ambushed by North Vietnamese troops. Doctors had once told Walt he'd never walk again. But as he liked to put it, I've been told worse by better men. He walked anyway, slow, stiff, and stubborn, but he walked. Jenny, the diner's hostess, greeted him with a warm smile. "Morning, Sergeant Morgan. Your usual. Still not dead, Jenny." "So I guess it is," he replied, managing the ghost of a grin. "Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, dry rye toast. No butter." That's how Walt liked it. He could have asked them to bring it to his table, everyone would have understood, but he never did. Even with the shaking hands, even with the pain flaring through his spine like broken glass, he carried his own tray. He called it a little ceremony of independence. Some things you don't surrender, no matter how old you get. He steadied his tray at the self-serve counter, his cane resting against it. The coffee sloshed slightly as he lifted it. A tremor in his right hand nearly tipped the plate, but he corrected in time. Step by agonizing step, he began the journey across the floor of Harper's. For men sat in a booth near the windows, wearing matching shirts that read Lakewood Invitational Base Tournament. They were laughing and drinking beers despite the hour. One of them tilted his chin toward Walt and said loudly, "Christ, look at this guy. Took the scenic route through Normandy, or something." Another snickered. $10 says he spills that coffee before he makes it 5 feet. Jenny looked up, but said nothing. A few nearby diners shifted in their seats. No one said a word. Walt didn't stop walking. He reached his favorite booth by the window, where the sun warmed the wood grain and softened the ache in his bones. As he began to lower the tray onto the table, a fork slid off and clattered to the floor. He froze, his face unmoved, the effort of bending down plainly painful. Still, he began the slow, calculated maneuver to retrieve it. Then came another voice from a booth. "I'd help, but I don't do cosplay. Army guys, huh?" The laughter that followed was quieter, meaner. Not just noise, but a bar meant to pierce. Walt didn't flinch. Years of combat, training, and post-war recovery had built in him a kind of unbreakable stillness. He reached slowly for the fallen fork when Marlene, his usual waitress, appeared with a clean one. "Let me get that for you, Mr. Morgan," she said, kneeling to pick up the other. "I'm sorry about." "Not your fault, Marlene," he said, voice calm as polished steel. He laid out his napkin, adjusted his toast, and began to eat. At the back of the diner, near the emergency exit, sat a man in dress blues. The twin silver eagles on his shoulders identified him as Colonel Gabriel H. Nolan, a decorated Air Force officer en route to Washington, D.C., for a Pentagon summit. He had noticed Walt the moment he entered. Military men tend to recognize each other even when decades, branches, or wars separate them. The colonel had seen the whole thing, every look, every muttered comment, every moment of indifference. His untouched coffee sat cooling before him. The colonel stood. He walked to Walt's table, past the laughing men, past the stunned waitstaff, and picked up the fork Walt had been about to reach for. Then, without saying a word, he placed it on the table's edge, stepped back, and stood at full attention behind the veteran's seat. The room, stopped breathing. His boots clicked together, his back straightened to a precise angle, and his arms locked to his sides. He didn't look around, didn't demand anything. He simply stood. Honor had entered the room. Walt looked up slightly and caught the colonel's reflection in the diner's window. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that words could never carry, something only understood by those who've led men in war and buried them in peace. The chatter in the diner vanished. Plates sat untouched. Coffee went cold. People stared, not out of curiosity, but reverence. One of the loudmouths from the booth, emboldened by shame or stupidity, scoffed. "What's this, a military parade? You two want to pose for a calendar." The colonel didn't move. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and drew out an old photo laminated in clear plastic. He held it high, facing the booth of hecklers. The picture showed a mud-covered soldier, young Walt Morgan, carrying a wounded Marine through thick jungle. "This man," the colonel said, his voice steady and unwavering, "carried me 3 miles through enemy fire with a bullet in his leg. I was 19. He was 31. He saved my life outside of Inlock. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't have a family. I wouldn't have this uniform." Silence followed. The man who'd mocked Walt earlier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, we didn't know. You didn't ask," the colonel replied, softly but firmly. Then, turning to Marlene, he added, "His breakfast is on me." From the back office, a tall man in a white apron emerged. Charles Harper himself, founder of the diner and son of a World War II veteran. "I saw everything," he said quietly, walking toward Walt's table. "Sergeant Morgan, would you allow us to name this booth in your honor?" Walt looked up. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Charles replied, "and to every person here who needed to be reminded what respect looks like." Within minutes, a small brass plaque was mounted above the booth, reserved for Sergeant Walt Morgan, still standing. The next Sunday, Walt entered as always, but this time the mood inside Harper's was different. People rose as he passed. The men who had mocked him were already seated near the counter, somber and silent. One of them stood. "Sergeant Morgan," he began, "we're here to offer you a proper apology. My father served in Desert Storm. He'd disown me if he saw how I acted." Walt studied the man. The fishing shirt, the baseball cap, the regret. "You apologized," he said, then added, "but next time, don't laugh behind a man you've never spoken to. Sit with him. You might learn something." The man nodded. Colonel Nolan walked in moments later, this time in civilian clothes, and Walt gestured to the seat across from him. A ritual was born that morning, one of quiet breakfasts, old war stories, and new respect. Marlene wore a small pin with the Army insignia Walt had given her. Over the weeks, other veterans joined. Korean War, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. Sometimes they just nodded. Sometimes they talked. But every Sunday, Walt's booth was never empty again. Because some men don't raise their voices. They just stand and the world remembers.